In the vast, unforgiving plains of North Dakota, honesty is measured in the strength of your structures. But to the locals in the county, William Wynne was an enigma wrapped in a contradiction. He owned a barn, a sagging, gray-timbered giant that looked ready to surrender to the next stiff breeze. Yet, inside that decaying shell, William was building a masterpiece of survival engineering. A tiny 15-foot Quonset hut made of military-grade galvanized steel, hidden away from prying eyes. For months, the townspeople saw him hauling rolls of high-density insulation and thick steel plates into the barn. They laughed over coffee at the local diner, calling it Will's Tin Coffin. They didn't see the square-jawed veteran welding the curved seams with the precision of a man who had seen bunker busters fail. Beside him, Smoky, his K9 shadow, watched the barn perimeter with a fierce, amber-eyed intensity. To the world, the barn was a ruin. To William, the barn was a decoy. And the Quonset inside was the only heart that would beat when the sky finally fell. He salt-cured meat and stacked cases of water within those curved walls, preparing for a ghost that hadn't walked these plains in 45 years. The old-timer spoke of 1981 in hushed tones, the year the mercury froze and the wind turned to A, solid wall of white. William Wynne remembered it as a boy, and the veteran in him knew the signs. By late afternoon, the horizon didn't just get dark, it vanished. The pressure dropped so fast, it caused the ancient timbers of the barn to groan like a dying beast. While his neighbors were busy sealing their modern homes with plastic wrap and hoping for the best, William whistled for Smoky. It wasn't a casual call, it was a combat command. They entered the barn just as the first 80-mile-per-hour gust hit, shaking the massive structure to its foundation. William stepped into the Quonset, the curved steel door clicking shut with a sound of absolute finality. Outside, the world was being dismantled. The barn's outer skin, the gray where they laughed at, was being stripped away by the wind. But the Quonset, anchored by 12-foot steel pilings, didn't move an inch. He lit a small fat burning stove, the scent of animal grease and iron filling the tiny space. The 45-year ghost had returned, and William Wynne was the only man in the county who had built a cage strong enough to hold it out. At 2 a.m., the giant fell. A massive snow cornice, built up on the barn's roof, finally exceeded the structural limit of the rotted wood. With a sound like a freight train derailment, the main rafters of the barn gave way. Tens of tons of timber and ice came crashing down. Inside the Quonset, the noise was deafening, a thunderous clang as the wooden debris hit the steel shell. William Wynne grabbed Smoky, shielding the dog's head as the world seemed to implode around them. But the Quonset didn't buckle. Its curved geometry, the very shape they had laughed at, distributed the weight of the collapse perfectly. For an hour, William sat in the dark, listening to the creak of the wreckage above. They were buried. The wooden barn was gone, replaced by a tomb of splintered beams and packed snow. But inside the tin coffin, the temperature was a steady 65 degrees. He lit a candle, the small flame steady. He wasn't trapped. He was cocooned. He looked at Smoky and saw the same soldierly resolve in the dog's eyes. They were alive, but the valley below was being systematically erased. And William knew that as soon as the wind died, he would have to dig his way out of his own fortress to save the people who had called him a fool. Day 2 of the whiteout. The world outside the steel curve of the Quonset was a silent, frozen graveyard. But inside, William Wynne was preparing for a counterattack. The air was getting heavy, a sign that the external vents were choked by the barn's wreckage. William didn't panic. He executed. He grabbed his heavy-duty cordless reciprocating saw, its blade tipped with carbide. He had to breach the Quonset's door not outward, which was impossible against the tons of debris, and hung upward through the ventilation hatch he'd reinforced for this exact nightmare. Smoky stood below him, his K-9 instincts vibrating as he watched his master climb the internal ladder. The scream of the saw against the galvanized steel was a mechanical war cry that echoed in the tiny space. Sparks showered down, illuminating William's salt and pepper beard and the sweat carving channels through the dust on his face. When the steel finally gave way, a wall of crystalline powder collapsed inward, a freezing reminder of the monster waiting above. William tunneled through the wood and snow like a mole, his muscular frame pushing against the weight of the collapsed barn. When his hand finally broke the surface, the air that hit his lungs wasn't just cold, it was lethal. But as he pulled Smoky up into the blinding light, he saw the first sign that the valley was in true peril. A faint, red distress flare 3 miles out, bleeding into the white sky. The walk to the source of the flare was a journey through a world that had forgotten the concept of life. William Wynne moved with a rhythmic mechanical gait, his military-grade snowshoes clicking against the ice crust. Beside him, Smoky was a ghost in the drift, his black and tan coat the only color in a universe of gray and white. The wind was a physical weight, pushing against William's broad shoulders, trying to drive the cold through the layers of his tactical parka. He didn't think about the freezing temperature. He thought about the math of survival. Every 30 minutes, he checked Smoky's paws for ice balls. Every 60 minutes, he consumed a high-calorie tallow strip. They reached the neighbor's ranch, the Henderson place. It was a disaster. Their modern, eco-friendly house had been decapitated by the wind. The solar panels were shattered glass, and the heat pump system was a frozen corpse. The flare had come from the master bedroom, where the walls had partially held. William used his tactical axe to clear a path through a shattered window. Inside, the Hendersons, the same people who had laughed at his tin coffin, were huddled under a pile of damp carpets, their skin the color of ash. Extraction was a battle of physics against fate. William Wynne tied the Henderson family together with a high-tensile paracord, creating a human chain with himself at the front and Smoky at the rear. The father, Henderson, tried to apologize through chattering teeth, but William silenced him with a single moss-green glare. "Keep your breath for the walk," he barked. The trip back was 3 times harder. The wind had shifted, turning the previous trail into a trap of deep, soft powder. William became a human plow, his muscular frame carving a trench for the family to crawl through. Every time one of the children faltered, Smoky would nudge them with his powerful shoulders. AK-9 drill sergeant keeping the line moving. The cold was a predatory animal, biting at their exposed skin. But the thought of the Quonset, the tin coffin they had mocked, was the only thing keeping them from lying down and surrendering to the sleep of the frost. When the jagged silhouette of the collapsed barn finally appeared through the whiteout, it didn't look like a ruin anymore. It looked like the gates of heaven, forged in galvanized steel. The transition was a shock to the senses. One by one, the Hendersons tumbled from the screaming 60 below void into the pressurized warmth of the Quonset. As the steel hatch hissed shut, the roar of the North Dakota blizzard was replaced by the low, comforting hum of the tallow stove. The tiny space, once a solitary cell for a veteran and his dog, was now a crowded field hospital. William Wynne moved with a cold, tactical grace, peeling off their frozen layers before the moisture could turn into a secondary chill. Henderson sat on a storage crate, his hands trembling as he looked at the curved, insulated walls he had once called a joke. The heat inside was a thick, tangible presence, smelling of iron and survival. William handed out mugs of thick, nutrient-dense broth, the very food they had mocked him for stockpiling. As the color slowly returned to children's faces, a heavy silence settled over the room. It wasn't just a silence of relief. It was a silence of people realizing that every luxury they owned had failed them, and their lives now depended on a man who valued a steel bolt more than a stock portfolio. William sat by the stove, his moss-green eyes fixed on the pressure gauge. They were safe for the moment, but the storm of the century was far from over. By the third night, the storm entered a new, terrifying phase. The wind had stopped its horizontal assault, but the sheer volume of snow falling was creating a crushing pressure on the wreckage of the barn above. Every few hours, a deep, resonant groan would echo through the steel walls of Quonset, the sound of wooden barn rafters snapping under the weight of 10 feet of packed ice. William Wynne sat at the back of the hut, his ears tuned to the structural vibrations. He knew that the Quonset's curved shape would protect them from a direct collapse. But if the barn's main ridge beam fell in a certain way, it could block the emergency hatch he'd just used. "We need to clear the top," William whispered to Henderson. The younger man looked at the ceiling in terror, but William was already reaching for his gear. They couldn't just wait to be buried alive. He handed Henderson a tactical shovel. "Smoky and I will go up. You stay here and maintain the stove. If the ceiling starts to buckle, you get the kids under the bunk frame. That's the strongest point." William looked at Smoky, and the dog stood up, ready to face the void again. They weren't just surviving. They were maintaining a perimeter against the very weight of the mountain. As William worked to clear the weight from the Quonset, the silence of the night was shattered by another light. This time, it wasn't red. It was a rhythmic, pulsing blue light coming from the direction of the county road. A heavy-duty National Guard plow was trying to push through the 6-foot drifts, but it was bogged down, its massive engine screaming in the cold. William Wynne stood on the ruins of his barn, his searchlight cutting through the mist. He realized the plow was headed in the wrong direction, straight toward a buried creek bed where the ice wouldn't hold its weight. He didn't have a radio to reach them, but he had the training of a combat engineer. He grabbed his tactical flare gun and aimed it at the sky, 1 shot to get their attention, 2 shots to warn them off. Smoky barked at the blue light, his voice carrying through the freezing air like a bell. As the flares erupted in the dark, the plow slowed to a halt. William watched through his binoculars as the vehicle began to reverse. He had just saved the only rescue vehicle in 10 miles from a watery grave. But as he turned back to the hatch, he saw something else. The heat from the Quonset was causing the snow around the base of the barn to melt and refreeze, creating a solid, impenetrable shell of ice. If he can get back inside now, he'd be locked out of his own sanctuary, back inside the steel curve. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool and the sharp ozone of the storm. William Wynne didn't celebrate his return. He immediately went to the wall, checking the structural rivets. The groaning of the barn above had intensified. Miller watched him, eyes wide with the realization that their sanctuary was under an immense, shifting weight. "The ice is sealing us in, isn't it?" Miller asked, his voice cracking. William looked at him, his moss-green eyes as steady as the steel around them. "It's not just sealing us in, it's pressing down. We're an arch, Miller. Arches are strong. But every arch has a breaking point." He began to deploy the emergency struts, telescoping steel poles he designed to brace the center of the Quonset. As he and Miller hammered the pins into place, Smoky stood guard at the base of the ladder, his ears twitching at every snap and pop from the wreckage above. They were fighting a war of inches against the gravity of the North Dakota winter. Every bolt tightened, was a minute of life bought for the children sleeping just feet away. William Wynne, the madman of the county, was now the only structural engineer between this family and a crushing end. The fourth morning brought a change in the atmosphere. The violent shaking of the wind had died down to a low, predatory hum, but the cold, the true, heart-stopping cold, had settled in. William Wynne checked the external thermometer, -65. At this temperature, steel becomes brittle and skin dies in seconds. The Quonset was now a thermos of life in a vacuum of death. William sat at his small shortwave radio, his fingers dancing across the dials. Suddenly, a signal broke through the static, not from the National Guard, but from the county sheriff, operating out of a mobile command post. Anyone, North Sector, we have a plow stuck. Need eyes on the creek road. William didn't hesitate. He grabbed the microphone. This is Wynne. I have eyes. I warned them off the creek 3 hours ago. I have 4 survivors in my Quonset. We are stable, but we are buried. The silence on the other end was heavy. The sheriff knew William Wynne, the crazy vet with a barn. Wynne, you're alive? We thought that barn was a matchstick in this wind. William looked at Smoky and a rare, grim smile touched his lips. The barn was the matchstick, Sheriff. The Quonset is the bunker. But the bunker had a flaw, not in its steel, but in its biology. With 5 people and a high-energy dog in a 15-foot space, the oxygen was being depleted faster than the frozen vents could replenish it. William Wynne noticed it first. The flame on the tallow stove was turning a sickly orange, flickering for air. Miller was becoming lethargic, his head lolling against the steel. William knew the symptoms of CO2 buildup. The ice shell he had seen on the surface was airtight. They weren't just buried. They were sealed in a tomb of their own making. He looked at Smoky, whose breathing was getting heavy. Miller, get up. William roared, his own lungs burning. He grabbed a manual hand drill and a long copper pipe. He had to breach the steel roof again, not for an exit, but for a straw. He climbed the ladder, every movement feeling like he was lifting lead weights. He began to drill through the galvanized curve. The rhythmic scritch-scritch of the metal, the only sound in the suffocating silence. If he didn't break through to the air soon, the tin sanctuary would become the tin coffin his neighbors had predicted. The copper pipe was a lifeline, but the mountain of ice above was a living entity. As the sub-zero temperatures stabilized, a new sound began to haunt the Quonset, a low-frequency thrumming that vibrated through the steel floor. The massive weight of the collapsed barn was beginning to settle, the wood fibers groaning under a pressure that no farmhouse was ever meant to endure. William Wynne, his lungs finally clear, sat on the floor with Smoky, his hand feeling the vibrations. He knew the physics of his slow crush. If the barn's main ridge beam shifted 3 inches to the left, it would bypass his internal struts and implode the Quonset's curved spine. He looked at the Henderson family, who were now eating their first warm meal in 24 hours. They saw safety. William saw a tactical stalemate. He realized that the only way to ensure their long-term survival was to weaken the ice shell from the inside. He began to rig a series of thermal reflectors using the mylar blankets, directing the heat of the tallow stove toward the specific points where the barn's beams met the steel. It was a delicate gamble, melt just enough to shift the weight, but not so much that they were crushed by a secondary collapse. Smoky watched the ceiling with an intensity that rivaled his master's, his K9 senses tracking the microscopic movements of the wood above them. Day 5, the atmospheric bomb had transitioned into a brittle, frozen clarity. Through the copper pipe, William could hear the distant high-pitched whine of a hydraulic pump. The National Guard plow from Part 9 hadn't given up. It had found the ridge road William had signaled with his flares. The rhythmic blue light began to pulse against the snow above the air intake. William Wynne didn't wait for them to find him. He needed to help them navigate the minefield of his own collapsed barn. He grabbed a portable laser beacon, a remnant of his combat engineering days, and aimed it straight up through the copper pipe. The green beam cut through the freezing air like a needle, hitting the undersides of the low-hanging storm clouds. On the surface, the rescue team stopped. They didn't see a farm. They saw a pillar of green light erupting from a mountain of white. William whistled for Smoky, and the two of them prepared for the breach. He handed Henderson a tactical whistle. "When the digging starts, you blow this. They need to know exactly where the airlock is." William climbed the ladder, his boots echoing on the steel, a soldier preparing to meet the reinforcements he'd spent half a decade preparing for. The breach happened at 10 a.m. on the sixth day. The heavy steel hatch groaned as it was wrenched open from the outside, and a flood of natural, freezing light poured into the tin coffin. For the Hendersons, it was a rebirth. For William Wynne, it was a tactical extraction. As the National Guard medics lowered the litters, William refused the first one. "Get the kids out." "Then the dog," he commanded, his voice still that of a master sergeant. He stood at the bottom of the ladder, his tall and muscular frame casting a long shadow against the silver mylar walls that had kept them all alive. As Smoky was winched up, the dog looked back at his master, amber eyes full of silent, shared history. Finally, William Wynne climbed out, stepping onto the wreckage of the barn he'd owned for 20 years. He looked at the valley, a landscape of shattered glass mansions and broken dreams, and then at his Quonset, the tiny steel heart that had refused to stop beating. He didn't ask for a medal. He didn't ask for an apology. He simply petted Smoky, adjusted his tactical parka, and looked toward the next farm. The storm was over, but the work of a soldier is never truly done. The rescue of the Hendersons was only the first ripple in a frozen pond. As the National Guard plow struggled to clear the main arteries, the commander, a young major named Vance, realized his GPS and satellite comms were being scrambled by the lingering atmospheric ion charge from the storm. He needed a local guide who understood the terrain of 1981 and the military precision of 2026. He found that man standing on a pile of barn wreckage. William Wynne didn't just provide directions. He provided a mobile command center. He spent the next 6 hours helping the Guard rig a specialized antenna to the top of his Quonset, utilizing the silver mylar reflectors he'd installed to boost the signal. Smoky was already in the lead Humvee, his nose serving as the most reliable sensor for buried gas lines. The tin coffin had become the digital heart of the North Sector. William stood over a topographic map, his moss-green eyes as sharp as a sniper's scope, marking the locations of every weak modern house he knew would have collapsed. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a tactical brain of the entire county's resurrection. But where there's disaster, there's also the dark side of human nature. As the National Guard focused on life-saving extractions, a group of local scavengers, armed and desperate, began targeting the abandoned luxury estates. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for jewelry, electronics, and the precious heating fuel that remained in the half-buried tanks. William Wynne saw the flashes of non-military flashlights on the South Ridge. He knew that if they reached the medical supply drop, people would die. He didn't wait for the major's permission. He grabbed his old service rifle and checked the action. Smoky let out a low, vibrating growl that rattled the Quonset steel floor. "Watch the perimeter," William told the soldiers. He and Smoky slipped out into the fog of the thaw, a two-man recon team entering a war's shadows. The scavengers thought the storm was their cover. They didn't realize they were being hunted by a man who had built his own sanctuary and was prepared to defend the entire valley as if it were his own bunker. By day 8, the temperature did the unthinkable. It rose 40 degrees in 12 hours. The atmospheric bomb was over, but its legacy was billions of gallons of melting ice. The Bitterroot Creek, which William had warned the guard about, was now a roaring, muddy dragon. The snow wasn't just melting, it was sliding. Mudslides began to rip through the lower valley, threatening the very medical tent city the guard had established. William Wynne, standing on the ridge with Major Vance, realized the drainage was blocked by the debris of the luxury estates. He had one last trick inside his buried Quonset, a crate of industrial water pumps and military-grade drainage tubing he bought surplus years ago. He and Smoky led a team back down into the hole of the barn. They weren't digging for people now. They were digging for the tools to stop a flood. As he hauled the heavy pumps up into the muddy light, William would look like a man forged in iron and grit, a veteran who understood that in North Dakota, if the cold doesn't kill you, the water will try to finish the job. The water was receding, but the ground beneath Bitterroot had become a treacherous sponge. The high-speed thaw was liquefying the subsoil, and the luxury estates on the hillside, built for the view rather than the geology, began to groan once more. William Wynne, navigating the perimeter with Smoky, noticed the telltale signs. Tension cracks in the mud as wide as a man's boot. He knew that the main relief road, the only path for the heavy medical convoys, was sitting on a shelf of sliding clay. While the county officials were busy arguing over insurance claims, William was back in his Quonset, heart of his secret stash. He unearthed a set of heavy-duty ground anchors and steel tension cables, surplus from a bridge-building project in another life. He didn't wait for a permit. He and Smoky hauled the gear to the dead man's curve. As the earth shifted beneath him, William hammered the first anchor into the stable granite bedrock deep below the mud. He was a man stitching a mountain back together with steel and sweat. Smoky stayed on the high ground, his K9 ears tracking the subaudible pops of snapping roots and shifting stone, acting as William's early warning system against a catastrophic slide. But the receding water left behind more than just mud. The flood had breached the chemical storage shed of the local aesthetic greenery plant, a facility full of concentrated pesticides and fertilizers. A toxic plume was now creeping toward the community's primary well. William Wynne, checking his sensors inside the Quonset, noticed a chemical spike on his water testing kit. He knew the authorities would be too slow, bogged down by protocols. He donned his old NBC nuclear biological chemical suit, a relic of his service days, and prepared a specialized charcoal filtration system he'd built for the Quonset's own backup supply. He and Smoky headed into the hot zone. The air smelled of bitter almonds and rot. William moved a methodical, mass pace, bypassing the containment line to reach the source. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a biohazard engineer fighting a silent, liquid enemy. Smoky, wearing a specialized K9 muzzle filter, stayed at his side, his loyal amber eyes watching through the fog for any signs of further leaks. Peace was returned, but justice was still a ghost. The group of scavengers William had captured in Part 17 were being processed by the local authorities. But a new group had emerged, organized, well-armed, and targeting the centralized food warehouse. They thought the valley was weak. They didn't count on the man who had turned the barn into a fortress. William Wynne didn't want a firefight, but he understood the language of deterrence. He utilized the Quonset's high-powered generator to rig a series of floodlights and a high-decibel acoustic device around the warehouse. When the looters arrived under the cover of a moonless night, they didn't find a helpless target. They found the wrath of Wynne. A wall of blinding light hit them, followed by a sound so intense it felt like a physical blow. William stood on the roof of the warehouse, silhouetted against the glare. Smoky at his side, like a statue of war. He didn't fire a shot. He simply let the power of his preparation do the talking. The looters fled into the night, realizing that the crazy vet had turned the entire valley into his personal AO. The storm had passed, but the battle against the chaos had only just begun. Modern homes with their flashy facades now revealed their fragile nature. William Wynne was no longer the cram-yard madman. He had become the reluctant architect of the valley's renaissance. Neighbors who had once mocked him now lined up outside the ruins of the old barn, hoping to learn how to build a fat-fired heating system or how to reinforce walls using Quonset techniques. William didn't refuse, but he imposed strict military discipline. The small Quonset barn became a survival classroom, where the delicate hands of lawyers and businessmen began learning to wield hammers and welders. Smoky, with his reflective K9 armband, patrolled among the groups like a true foreman. Here, in this steel cocoon, a new community was taking shape, not based on real estate value, but on resilience and preparedness. William gazed at the faces smudged with grease and soot, a quiet pride gleaming in his emerald green eyes. Bitterroot Valley was relearning the most basic lesson. Life isn't bought with money. It's built with steel and willpower. However, the ghosts of the past still haunted the land. When the snow melted, it revealed a massive sinkhole right beneath the main road leading to the valley's only food reserve. A medical supply truck was stuck, its wheels dangling over the edge of a muddy abyss. The National Guard rescue team couldn't reach it because of the truck's weight. William Wynne looked through his binoculars. He knew it was time to use inverse arch technique. He and Smoky braved the mud, carrying curved steel plates from the roof of the spare Quonset. His plan was to create a temporary bridge based on the tension of the steel instead of the weight of the wooden beams, while the mud slid beneath their feet. William had to dive under the groaning truck to place the steel anchors. Smoky stood on the edge of the abyss, barking incessantly whenever the ground showed any sign of shifting. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a battle of wits between the experience of an old military engineer and the devastating geological conditions of the valley after the storm. The relentless efforts began to take their toll on the old soldier's body. William Wynne, however strong he was, could not resist exhaustion and the bone-chilling cold. One night, while patrolling the food depot after the events of Part 21, he collapsed in the darkness. A high fever from overwork and an old, infected leg wound from the mud caused him to lose consciousness. Smoky stayed by his side. The dog began to use the very skills William had taught him. Instead of barking wildly to attract attention, it pulled a mylar blanket from William's backpack to cover him, then lay down on his chest to transfer heat. This was a final test of William's preparation, not of steel or food, but of preparing his most loyal partner to know what to do when the leader fell. Smoky kept William alive through the coldest night of the fall, until Miller's patrol found them thanks to the flashing beacon on the dog's collar. William Wynne's recovery unfolds in the quiet confines of the very structure he created. Quonset, once considered a symbol of paranoia, now symbolizes rebirth. As William gradually regains his strength under the care of Miller and his neighbors, he realizes that Bitterroot Valley has changed forever. The gleaming SUVs and opulent glass houses are gone, replaced by more practical structures. William sits in his old armchair beside the greased fireplace, Smoky at his feet, his dog's ears perked up, listening for the sounds of reconstruction outside. He begins to sketch plans for a network of Quonset shelters connecting the valley, a defense system impregnable by nature. William is no longer a lone soldier. He has become the soul of a new Bitterroot, where each inhabitant now possesses a touch of the discipline and resilience of an old veteran. Bitterroot Valley isn't just reviving. It's transforming into a fortress. Under William Wynne's guidance, a second settlement has sprung up around the ruins of the old farm. Gone are the flimsy plastic and glass houses. Instead, a row of steel Quonset domes, partially buried underground to take advantage of geothermal energy and withstand the wind. William stands atop the hill, looking down a construction site where his neighbors, now skilled workers, assemble the steel modules. Smoky runs between the huts, acting as a messenger and security alert. The former arrogance has been replaced by a tightly knit community bound by survival rules William has forged in his blood. The small Quonset in the original barn now serves as a command center, storing seeds, medicine, and maps of the entire region. William Wynne turned a disaster into an opportunity to build something more enduring than houses. He built an indomitable spirit. Winter finally unleashed its last desperate attack. A late blizzard, though not as powerful as the previous monster, was enough to test Bitterroot's new structures. This time, there was no panic. When the air raid siren sounded, everyone moved orderly into their Quonset domes. William Wynne stood outside the central base's door, Smoky beside him, watching the snow begin to fall again. They were no longer afraid. They had food, warmth, and protection of steel. While the world outside the valley still grappled with the aftermath of the storm, Bitterroot had become an oasis of stability. William saw the warm light emanating from the vents of the neighboring Quonsets and smiled. He had turned those who had once mocked him into comrades. The last breath of winter only boosted their confidence. William Wynne and his dog Smoky proved that preparation isn't about fear, but about freedom. The freedom to stand firm when everything else crumbles. April arrived in the Bitterroot Valley not with flowers, but with a whisper of melting. The 10-foot-thick layer of snow, once a deadly enemy, had transformed into an ocean of gray mud and sluggish floodwaters. William Wynne stood atop the hill, Smoky beside him, gazing down at the changing valley. The modern facades of the luxurious mansions had been stripped bare by the blizzard, leaving only rotting wooden skeletons and crumbling walls battered by the water. But amidst this desolation, William's steel Quonsets, half buried underground, emerged as islands of stable life. However, the melting brought a new challenge: geological instability. Stress cracks began to appear in the muddy silt like razor cuts. William Wynne, a former Army engineer, understood the meaning of those cracks. "The valley is moving," he whispered to Smoky. The dog barked a warning, its amber eyes fixed on the vital road that was beginning to sink. The more it melted, the more dangerous Bitterroot became. The dead man's curve, the lifeline to the central food and medicine depot, was being swallowed inch by the mountain groaning. Water-saturated clay geology was sliding, threatening to cut Bitterroot off from the outside world. William Wynne understood that if the road collapsed, the entire valley would starve. He returned to the Quonset command post, pulling out the last crates of industrial explosives, things he had prepared not for attack, but for engineering. He and Smoky had entered the hot zone to detonate the granite dam upstream, diverting the floodwaters away from the weak roadbed. It was a suicide mission. William slung the rucksack containing the explosives over his shoulder, whistled for Smoky, and stepped outside. His hidden bedroom was now empty, its furnishings sacrificed to the valley. But William Wynne knew the mission of an old engineer was not yet over. The storm of the century had passed, the mudslide disaster averted, but Bitterroot had changed forever. A year later, William Wynne sat on the porch of the central Quonset dome, a cup of hot coffee in his hand, looking down at the reborn valley. Gone were the gleaming glass palaces and luxury estates. Instead, a community of steel Quonset houses, built to survive, not a display. His hidden bedroom was no longer a secret. It was the prototype for every house in the valley. William held no official position. He didn't need one. He was the architect of the ridge, the one who stayed when the world turned to ice. Each summer, the sounds of drilling and hammering echoed, but it was no longer the sound of madness. It was the sound of a valley that had learned its hardest lesson. William rose, Smoky, older, his muzzle graying, vigorously followed him. They watched the sunset adorn Bitterroot with fiery red and gold. William Wynne and his dog Smoky earned their peace, not by avoiding the storm, but by becoming the anchor that the storm could never move.